What became of the family of the man Adolf Hitler himself called the man with the iron heart? When Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared and powerful figures in the entire Nazi apparatus, was struck down by assassins in the streets of Prague in the spring of 1942, he left behind a wife, 4 young children, a mother, a brother and a sister, all of whom would spend the rest of their lives navigating the impossible shadow cast by one of history's most notorious criminals. The story of what happened to them is not a simple tale of justice or redemption. It is a story of defiance and denial, of struggle and survival, of children who never truly knew their father yet could never escape his name, and of a widow who fought bitterly for decades to preserve a legacy that the rest of the world was desperate to bury forever. In this video, we will find out exactly what happened to every member of Reinhard Heydrich's family after the Second World War. So, without further ado, let's start from the very beginning. To understand what happened to Heydrich's family, we first need to understand who Reinhard Heydrich was, and why his death sent shockwaves not only through the Nazi high command, but through the lives of everyone who bore his name. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich was born on March 7th, 1904, in Halle an der Saale, a city in what was then the German Empire. He came from a cultured bourgeois background. His father, Bruno Richard Heydrich, was a composer and the founder of the Halle Conservatory of Music. His mother, Elisabeth Maria née Krantz, was an accomplished pianist. The family was steeped in the arts, and Reinhard himself was an extraordinarily gifted violinist, a fact that would strike many observers as grotesquely incongruous, given the monstrous career that awaited him. He was also, from early in his life, athletic, fiercely competitive, and possessed of an almost predatory intelligence. He spoke fluent French, was an excellent fencer, and showed an aptitude for languages and strategy that would serve him with terrifying efficiency in the decades to come. His path to the upper echelons of Nazi power was not entirely straightforward. After serving in the German Navy during the Weimar Republic years, he was dismissed in 1931 following a personal scandal involving a young woman and allegations of dishonorable conduct. It was a humiliation that could have ended his ambitions entirely. Instead, it redirected them. Heinrich Himmler, in the process of building up the SS, gave the young, disgraced naval officer an interview in 1931 and was immediately impressed. Heydrich, drawing on his naval intelligence background, outlined his vision for a security and intelligence apparatus, and within months he was in charge of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence service of the SS. From that position, he rose with astonishing speed. By the time World War II began, Reinhard Heydrich was the head of the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, an organization that brought together the Gestapo, the SD, and the criminal police under one terrible umbrella. He was Heinrich Himmler's direct deputy, one of the most powerful men in Germany, and the man widely regarded as the primary architect of the Holocaust. It was Heydrich who chaired the Wannsee Conference on January 20th, 1942, the meeting at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the systematic murder of 11 million Jews across Europe. The conference lasted only 90 minutes, yet the decisions made in that room would result in the murder of 6 million Jewish people. He was, in the truest and most horrifying sense of the phrase, a key engineer of genocide. But before his death, before Operation Anthropoid and the bomb on a Prague street, there was also a private man. There was a husband, a father, a son. And it is the fate of those who loved him or who were bound to him by blood that this video concerns itself with. Because for all the enormity of what Heydrich did, the people who shared his name were left to answer for it in ways they never chose and could never fully escape. Let us begin with the assassination itself, because it was that single event in May 1942 that set everything in motion for the Heydrich family and determined the course of every life we will examine in this video. By the spring of 1942, Reinhard Heydrich had added another title to his already formidable collection. In September 1941, Hitler appointed him acting Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the occupied Czech territories. He arrived in Prague with a reputation that preceded him like a thundercloud. The Czechs called him variations on the same theme: the Butcher of Prague, the Blonde Beast, the Hangman. His methods in the Protectorate were swift and savage. He executed resistance leaders, deported Jews to the death camps, crushed dissent with exemplary terror. But he also, with characteristic cunning, used a combination of economic incentives and fear to stabilize Czech industrial production for the German war machine. Hitler was delighted. Heydrich was, in his master's view, the perfect viceroy. So perfect, in fact, that there was growing talk within the Nazi high command that he was being groomed for even greater responsibilities after the war, potentially to replace Himmler entirely or to be given responsibility for the occupation of France. It was precisely this combination of his importance to the regime and the terror he had inflicted on the Czech people that made Heydrich a target for the Czech government in exile, operating from London under President Edvard Beneš. In the autumn of 1941, the Czech and Slovak governments in exile, with the approval and logistical support of the British Special Operations Executive, began planning the most audacious assassination operation of the entire war. The mission, codenamed Operation Anthropoid, involved parachuting a small team of specially trained soldiers into occupied Czechoslovakia to kill Heydrich. The men chosen for the actual assassination attempt were Josef Gabčík, a Slovak, and Jan Kubiš, a Czech. They trained at special facilities in Britain, parachuted into Czechoslovakia in the early hours of December 29, 1941, and spent months preparing, hiding with local resistance families in Prague, and waiting for the right opportunity to present itself. That opportunity came on the morning of May 27, 1942. Heydrich had taken to travelling through Prague in an open-topped Mercedes-Benz staff car, an act of deliberate theatricality, a demonstration that he feared no one. He commuted daily between the Panenské Břežany estate north of Prague, where his family lived, and Prague Castle, where he maintained his offices as Reich Protector. On the morning in question, his car slowed to negotiate a hairpin bend on a street called v Holešovičkách in the Prague suburb of Holešovice. Gabčík stepped forward and raised his Sten submachine gun. It jammed. Heydrich, who might have simply ordered his driver to accelerate away, instead stood up in the car and drew his pistol, apparently unwilling to flee from a lone attacker. In that moment of pride or arrogance, Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade. It exploded under the rear wheel of the car, sending fragments of metal and horsehair from the upholstery tearing into Heydrich's body. His spleen was ruptured, and pieces of the car's upholstery were driven into his back and side. He staggered into the road, gun in hand, and tried to pursue his attackers before collapsing from blood loss. He was rushed to the Bulovka hospital in Prague. For 8 days, Heydrich hovered between life and death. His wounds were treated by German doctors who had been flown in from Berlin, and for a time it seemed he might survive. Hitler himself was kept closely informed of every development. Himmler visited the hospital. Messages of concern came from across the senior ranks of the Nazi regime. Karl Hermann Frank, the State Secretary for Bohemia and Moravia, coordinated the immediate security response. But on June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died. He was 38 years old. The cause of death was septicemia, almost certainly aggravated by the horsehair from the car's upholstery that had been driven deep into his body cavity and which the surgeons were unable to fully remove. Some historians have also suggested that the quality of German medical care was ironically a factor, with certain treatment decisions being made that may have worsened his condition. The reaction in Berlin was one of shock and fury. Hitler ordered a massive reprisal operation in Czechoslovakia, and in his home in the Bohemian countryside in the Grand Estate at Panenské Břežany, north of Prague, Lena Heydrich received the news that would reshape every remaining day of her life. Lena Mathilde Heydrich, née von Osten, had been born on June 14, 1911, in Fehmarn, a small island in the Baltic Sea off Föhr, the coast of what is now northern Germany. She came from a family with conservative, nationalist leanings, and her encounter with Reinhard Heydrich, which occurred at a naval dance in Kiel in December 1930, had been immediate and intense. Their courtship was swift, and their engagement even swifter, though it was complicated by the fact that Heydrich was, at the time, involved with another woman named Lena von Osten, was not the only woman in his life. That earlier relationship, and his failure to handle it honourably, contributed directly to his dismissal from the Navy in April 1931, after a naval honour court ruled that his conduct had been improper. Lena, far from distancing herself from him after this scandal, stood by him. She had been introduced to National Socialism by her brother, and she was already a convinced believer in the ideology. She and Reinhard married on December 26, 1931, in a ceremony that was attended by Heinrich Himmler, who was by this point already the man Heydrich was working with to build the SS security apparatus. Over the years that followed, as Heydrich's power grew to extraordinary heights, Lena moved within the highest circles of the Third Reich. She met Hitler, Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, and virtually every other senior figure in the Nazi hierarchy. She was a formidable personality in her own right, strong-willed, opinionated, and not easily intimidated even by her husband's fearsome reputation. She was also, by most accounts, genuinely devoted to him, and he to her, in the complicated way that was possible between two people who shared a ruthless ideology and a taste for power. Contemporary accounts describe Lena as a woman of considerable personal presence, someone who was not merely a passive appendage to her husband's career, but an active participant in the social and ideological world of the Nazi elite. She had strong opinions about policy, was not afraid to express them, and was known to argue with her husband on domestic and personal matters in ways that most people would not have dared argue with one of the most dangerous men in Germany. They had 4 children together during the years of the Third Reich. The eldest, Klaus, was born on July 17, 1933. The second, Haida, arrived on December 23, 1934. A daughter, Silke, was born on April 9, 1939, just months before the outbreak of the Second World War. And the youngest, another daughter named Marte, came into the world on July 23, 1942, more than 6 weeks after her father had already died from his wounds in the Prague hospital. Marte was, in the most literal possible sense, a child born into the aftermath of her father's death, a child who would never know him except through the accounts of others. When the news of Heydrich's death reached Lena at Panensky Brzeżany, she was heavily pregnant with Marte. She had known that the attack had taken place on May 27th, had known for 8 days that her husband was fighting for his life in a Prague hospital, and had presumably spent those 8 days in an agony of uncertainty. When the news came on June 4th that he had died, she was 30 years old, pregnant with her 4th child, and a widow. The Nazi state gave Heydrich a state funeral of enormous pomp and spectacle, deliberately designed to honour the fallen hero and to signal both grief and the promise of terrible retribution. His coffin lay in state in Prague Castle, the symbol of his authority as Reich protector, and tens of thousands of Czechs, many compelled to attend, filed past it. The cortege then moved to Berlin by special train, where another ceremony was held at the Reich Chancellery. Hitler himself delivered a lengthy and emotional eulogy, praising Heydrich as one of the finest men the German race had produced, calling him a man who had lived and died as a true National Socialist hero. Heydrich was buried with full military honours in Berlin's Invalids Cemetery, the resting place of some of Germany's greatest military figures through the centuries. Lena stood at the graveside, widowed, pregnant, surrounded by the most powerful men in Germany. But even as the Third Reich mourned with its full theatrical apparatus, the reprisals for Heydrich's death were already underway, and those reprisals would form one of the most terrible chapters of the entire occupation of Czechoslovakia. The Nazis were not content with hunting down the specific individuals responsible. They wanted to inflict collective punishment on the Czech population as a whole, to demonstrate what happened when one of Hitler's most valued lieutenants was touched. The scale and savagery of the response exceeded even the usual standards of Nazi terror in occupied Europe. The Nazis' vengeance for Operation Anthropoid was swift, comprehensive, and monstrous. On June 10, 1942, 6 days after Heydrich's death, the entire village of Lidice, located near Kladno in Bohemia, was destroyed. The SS and German police units surrounded the Jał village before dawn. They had decided, on the basis of false and fabricated intelligence, that the village had connections to the British agents responsible for the assassination. Every man and boy in Lidice over the age of 15, 173 people in total, was taken out and shot against the walls of a local farm that same morning. The women of the village, 184 in total, were loaded onto trucks and transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where many of them subsequently died from the brutal conditions. 90 children were taken into German custody. Most of them were deemed unsuitable for Germanization and were killed by carbon monoxide poisoning at the Chelmno extermination camp. The village itself was burned to the ground, the ash bulldozed into the earth, the very wells filled in with rubble. The Nazis literally attempted to erase Lidice from the face of the earth. A second village, Ležáky, where a radio transmitter used by a resistance network connected to the paratroopers had been discovered, was similarly destroyed on June 24, 1942. The entire adult population of Ležáky was executed. 2 children were taken for possible Germanization, and the village was razed. In all, the reprisals for the assassination of Heydrich resulted in the deaths of approximately 5,000 Czech people, including those killed at Lidis and Ležáky, those executed in mass shootings across the Protectorate, and those who died in subsequent arrests and deportations. It was one of the most catastrophic instances of collective reprisal killing carried out by the Nazi regime in Western or Central Europe during the entire war. The assassins themselves were eventually tracked down to a church in Prague where they had been hiding. The Church of Saints, Cyril and Methodius in the Reslova Street of Prague's new town, had sheltered them, along with several other paratroopers from related operations since the assassination. On June 10, 1942, after being betrayed by a fellow paratrooper named Karol Czerda, who was motivated by the enormous reward being offered by the Nazis and by fear, the church was surrounded by hundreds of SS troops supported by armoured vehicles. The battle that followed lasted for several hours. The paratroopers in the nave of the church held out with extraordinary courage before being killed or choosing to die. The three paratroopers in the crypt, including Gabčík and Kubiš, fought until their ammunition was exhausted. Water was pumped into the crypt in an attempt to flood them out. They took their own lives rather than surrender. Their deaths marked the end of Operation Anthropoid, but the consequences of what they had done for the Czech people, for the Nazi regime, and for the family of the man they had killed were only beginning to unfold. For Lena Heydrich, the immediate years following her husband's death were, in a cruel paradox, years of relative comfort even as the wider world burned around her. The Nazi state, honouring its fallen hero, continued to support his widow generously. She remained at Panenské Břežany, the grand estate that Heydrich had essentially requisitioned from a Jewish family who had been deported to the camps, where she managed the property and raised her children. The Panenské Břežany estate, known in German as Jungfern Břežan, was a magnificent property set in the Bohemian countryside north of Prague. It included a large manor house, extensive agricultural land, outbuildings and grounds that Lena managed with characteristic efficiency and determination. The family who had owned it before the war, the Bloch-Bauers, were prominent Jewish industrialists. They had been forced to flee or were deported by the Nazi occupation regime, and their property had been seized. Heydrich had moved his family into this estate when he took up his position as Reich Protector, and Lena had organised it as a functional household and working farm. There, Lena gave birth to Marte in July 1942, a child who would never know her father at all. She organised the agricultural work, oversaw the household, and in the years remaining to the war, attempted to create some kind of normal family life for her children amidst the surrounding catastrophe. She had domestic staff, agricultural workers, and the material resources of the estate at her disposal. In the strange bubble of the occupied protectorate, where a German woman of the Reich Protector's widow's status occupied a privileged position regardless of the horror being visited on the native Czech population around her, Lena maintained the estate with the same iron determination she brought to everything else in her life. But even within this relative security, tragedy struck with devastating force. On October 24, 1943, while riding his bicycle near the estate, Klaus Heydrich, the eldest son, just 10 years old, rode into the path of a German military truck. He was killed instantly. The accident happened on a road that Klaus would have known well, near the home he had lived in for the years of the Protectorate. He had been riding his bicycle, a normal childhood activity, on a road that was far more heavily trafficked with military vehicles than the roads of peacetime Germany would have been. The truck driver could not stop in time. Klaus, who had been born on July 17, 1933, and who had grown up as the son of one of the most powerful men in the Reich, was dead at 10 years old. He had known his father during the years of Heydrich's greatest power and had presumably worshipped him in the uncritical way that small boys worship their fathers, regardless of what those fathers do in the wider world. He had been just 9 years old when his father was assassinated, old enough perhaps to dimly understand that something terrible and irreversible had happened, but young enough that the full meaning of it was beyond his comprehension. He didn't live long enough to wrestle with that meaning or with the darker truths about who his father had been. His death on that Bohemian road in October 1943 was a grief upon grief for Lena Heydrich, who now had lost both her husband and her firstborn son within the space of 17 months. She had two surviving sons, Haida, who was 8 years old at the time of his brother's death, and the daughters Silke, who was 4, and the infant Marta, just over a year old. These were the children who would carry the Heydrich name into the post-war world. What did Lena tell them about their father as they grew? How did she present the man to his children in the years between his death and the end of the war? The private conversations at the dinner table, the stories told at bedtime, the answers given to a child's innocent questions about what Daddy had done. These are not recorded in the historical archives, but they were arguably the most formative influences on how the next generation of Heydrichs understood and related to their inheritance. Given everything we know about Lena's subsequent public positions, it is not difficult to imagine the version of Reinhard Heydrich that she presented to her children. He would have been presented as a hero, a warrior for Germany, a man who had given his life for his country and been taken from them by enemies who were also Germany's enemies. The ideology he had served, the crimes he had committed, the horror that the historical record would subsequently reveal in such overwhelming detail, none of these would have featured in Lena's domestic narrative. She would have given her children a father to be proud of. That was, after all, what she herself believed. The tragedy, from the perspective of those children, was that the version of their father they received in those early years was so radically at odds with the version that the wider world would eventually present to them. The collapse of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945 shattered the world that had sustained Lena and her children at Panenske Břežany. As Soviet and Allied forces closed in on Germany and the Nazi state disintegrated around her, Lena faced a future that was suddenly terrifyingly uncertain. She was the widow of a man who had been one of the most senior architects of genocide in human history. She was living in occupied Czech territory that would shortly be liberated and reclaimed by the Czechoslovak people who had suffered under her husband's rule, and she had 3 young children in her care. When the war ended in May 1945 and the Czechs reasserted control over their country, the consequences for Lena were immediate and dramatic. She was expelled from Czechoslovakia, along with the millions of Sudeten Germans and Reich Germans who had flooded into the country during the occupation. This expulsion was part of the enormous post-war population transfer that moved an estimated 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans out of Eastern Europe, an operation sanctioned by the Allied powers and carried out with varying degrees of order and brutality across different regions. Lena was stripped of the Panenske Břežany estate, which was returned to the Czech state and in due course became the property of the Czechoslovak government. She and her children were essentially pushed westward with whatever they could carry. The estate that she had managed with such determination, the home where her youngest children had been born and where her eldest had died, passed out of her hands forever. She left behind the grave of Klaus, the agricultural enterprise she had built, and the last physical connection to the years of her husband's greatest power. In the post-war chaos of Central Europe, millions of people were making similarly wrenching departures from places they had come to think of as home, but few of them were departing from homes that had been taken from Jewish families just years earlier. They ended up in Bavaria, in a country that was ruined, occupied, and slowly trying to come to terms with the magnitude of what it had done. For Lena Heydrich, these early post-war years were a severe material and psychological shock. The wealth, the status, the comfortable estate, the support of the Nazi state, all of it was gone. She found herself a widow in reduced circumstances, with 3 children to feed and educate, in an occupied country that was conducting a systematic attempt to identify, try and punish everyone who had played a significant role in the crimes of the Third Reich. The Allied occupation authorities were running denazification proceedings across all 4 zones of occupied Germany, and anyone with Lena's profile was certain to attract attention. Whether she herself would face criminal proceedings was an open question in the immediate post-war period. She was interrogated extensively by Allied investigators. She was called to give testimony in various proceedings connected to the trials of her husband's former subordinates and colleagues. The question of whether Lena could be directly implicated in criminal activities, rather than simply being the widow of a war criminal, was examined and ultimately resolved against prosecution. The evidence available to investigators at the time was insufficient to support specific criminal charges against her personally, and the focus of the major prosecutions was on those who had directly participated in the planning and execution of specific crimes rather than on family members of perpetrators. However, Lena did face denazification proceedings under the Allied Control Council's directives, which applied to all Germans and required individuals to be assessed for their degree of involvement with the Nazi regime. She was ultimately classified at a level that carried financial penalties and various restrictions, but did not involve imprisonment. The specific classification that was applied to her and the financial penalties that resulted varied over time. and were subject to appeals and revisions in the years that followed. What the denazification proceedings made clear was that Lena was considered an active participant in the Nazi world, rather than a passive bystander, but that the threshold for criminal prosecution was not met in her case. This outcome, which Lena would have considered an injustice in the opposite direction, since she regarded herself as innocent of any wrongdoing, set the stage for the decades of legal and financial battles that followed. Now, what happened next for Lena is perhaps one of the most extraordinary and, to many observers, disturbing sagas of post-war Germany. Rather than retreating into obscurity, rather than adopting a posture of shame or silence, Lena Heydrich spent the decades after the war fighting back. She fought for her widow's pension with relentless determination. She fought to recover whatever assets could be recovered. She fought against what she consistently described as the unfair historical treatment of her husband and herself. She maintained contact with networks of former SS members and their families, and ultimately, she wrote a book that encapsulated her worldview and her defiance in the most public possible way. The pension battle was the most prolonged and, in terms of its broader implications, the most significant of Lena's post-war legal struggles. In the Federal Republic of Germany, founded in 1949, the pension laws were a complex and often contradictory legacy of both the Weimar Republic's civil service provisions and the practical necessities of rebuilding a functioning state. Widows of men who had served in official government positions were generally entitled to pensions based on those positions, provided certain conditions were met. Heydrich had held some of the most senior positions in the Nazi state, with ranks and salaries to match, and in purely formal terms this should have entitled his widow to a substantial pension. But there were complicating factors that the courts would spend years trying to resolve. The fundamental legal question was whether the criminality of the activities conducted in the official positions should disqualify the entitlement. If Heydrich's role as head of the RSHA constituted participation in criminal organizations and criminal activities, which the Nuremberg tribunals had definitively established to be the case, should the widow of such an individual be able to claim a pension based on that criminal role? Different courts gave different answers to this question at different times, and the proceedings became a kind of running commentary on West Germany's ongoing, agonized relationship with its Nazi past. In the 1950s, when many former Nazis were being quietly reintegrated into West German society and the denazification process was being wound down or circumvented, there was considerable political pressure to simply resolve these pension questions in a way that would allow former Nazi families to settle down and stop drawing attention to uncomfortable histories. In the 1960s and beyond, as the public reckoning with Nazism intensified, the opposite pressure applied. Lena's specific pension case went through multiple rounds of the German court system over a period of more than 2 decades, from the late 1940s into the 1970s. At various points, she received partial awards. At other points, those awards were challenged by the state or by intervening parties. The proceedings generated substantial press coverage, which Lena found both useful and maddening. Useful because publicity kept her cause in the public eye and reminded people that she was fighting for what she insisted were her legitimate rights. Maddening because the press coverage invariably framed the issue in terms of her husband's crimes, connecting any discussion of her pension entitlement to the Holocaust and to the specific horrors of the RSHA and the Einsatzgruppen and the Wannsee Conference. There was, from her perspective, a fundamental injustice in this framing, because she was trying to fight a bureaucratic and legal battle and kept finding herself sucked back into the historical and moral one. The eventual outcome of Lena's pension proceedings, which came in the early 1970s after more than 2 decades of litigation, was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely. She received some pension entitlement, though at a level that critics regarded as inappropriately generous given the source of her husband's official rank, and that Lena herself regarded as inadequate compensation for what she was owed. The proceedings left a bitter taste in German public opinion and contributed to subsequent changes in German law that made it harder for the families of Nazi perpetrators to claim pension benefits based on criminal official roles. In this ironic way, Lena Heydrich's persistent legal battles actually contributed to the eventual strengthening of legal provisions that other perpetrator families might have hoped to exploit. Throughout all of this, Lena Heydrich was also engaged in what might be called the cultural battle for her husband's memory. She gave interviews to journalists, speaking with remarkable candor about her views and her refusal to accept the historical consensus on her husband's role. She maintained her network of contacts with former SS members and their families, participating in the social world of the unrepentant Nazi survivor community that existed, largely below the surface of respectable West German society throughout the post-war decades. This community had its own publications, its own meeting places, its own rituals of commemoration, and its own persistent counter-narrative about the war and its causes and conduct. Published in 1976, Lena Heydrich's memoir was titled in German Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, which translates as Life with a War Criminal. The title was not Lena's choice. It had been imposed by the publisher, the O. Grabert Verlag in Preußisch Oldendorf, as a condition of publication, apparently in an attempt to give the book a veneer of critical engagement that its actual content did not support. Lena was furious about the title, and she said so openly in subsequent interviews. In her view, the title was a libel against her husband because she did not accept that he had been a war criminal in any meaningful sense. The title was, she insisted, a commercial concession designed to sell books rather than an honest description of their contents. She was, in this specific complaint, largely correct. The contents of the book were a vigorous and essentially unapologetic defense of Reinhard Heydrich, and a challenge to the historical record that had convicted him posthumously in the court of history. The book caused enormous controversy in West Germany and internationally. Historians were outraged by its revisionism and its dismissal of documented evidence. Reviews in major German newspapers were withering. Survivor organizations condemned it, but the book found its audience among the community of people who wanted to believe that the accepted historical account of the Nazi leadership was distorted or exaggerated, and it sold well enough to provide Lena with some financial benefit. It also gave her a renewed platform, and she used it. In the years following the book's publication, she gave additional interviews, appeared on radio programs, and generally maintained a public profile that made her one of the most visible and most controversial figures among the survivors of the Nazi elite's inner circle. The reaction of her surviving children to the book's publication is not extensively documented in the historical record. Heydrich, then in his early 40s and living a private life as a businessman, would have found himself once again thrust into public association with his father's legacy in the most prominent possible way. His mother's publication was not simply a private act, but a public declaration, a throwing down of the gauntlet to the historical consensus, and by its very existence it made anyone named Heydrich into a public figure whether they wished to be or not. Silke and Marte, who had both been working to maintain the lowest possible profile, would have experienced the book's publication as a renewed intrusion into the private lives they were trying to construct. The tensions within the Heydrich family about how to navigate the weight of their shared name, tensions that were almost certainly present throughout the post-war years, were presumably at their most acute in the aftermath of Lena's decision to publish. One particular episode in Lena's post-war life that reveals the extent of her ongoing connections to the Nazi survivor network deserves specific mention. In the 1960s, Lena was identified as one of the participants in a network that provided financial and logistical support to former SS members who were facing legal proceedings in West Germany. This network, which overlapped with but was not identical to Stille Hilfe, drew on the social connections of the Nazi elite and their families to channel assistance to individuals who might otherwise have been left to face justice alone. Lena's involvement in these activities was documented by German investigative journalists and by government agencies monitoring neo-Nazi and revanchist organizations in the Federal Republic. The activities did not result in criminal charges against her, but they added to the picture of a woman who was not simply a widow trying to live a quiet life, but an active participant in an ongoing ideological and social community that had not relinquished its commitments. This brings us back to the broader question of what this environment meant for the children who grew up within it. For Heydrich, who was the oldest of the surviving children and therefore the most fully formed when his father died and the most exposed to his mother's world in the years that followed, the consequences were profound and lasting. He grew up in a household where the dominant narrative about the Nazi past was one of grievance and revisionism. where his father was presented as a hero who had been falsely condemned, where the community of family friends and social contacts shared an ideology that the mainstream of German society was progressively rejecting as the post-war decades passed. The gap between his mother's world and the world beyond the front door must have been disorienting and in some ways impossible to bridge. Reinhard Heydrich was born on December 23, 1934, making him one of the group of children who were old enough to have some genuine memories of their father and of life in the Nazi state, but young enough that those memories were the memories of a small child, rather than a young adult. He was 7 years old when his father was appointed acting Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was 7.5 when his father was assassinated. He was 9 when his older brother Klaus was killed in the road accident, and he was 10 when Germany collapsed entirely and his entire world came crashing down. By any measure, Reinhard Heydrich's early childhood was one of extraordinary upheaval and loss, a sequence of catastrophic events that would have marked any child profoundly. Growing up in post-war Bavaria with his mother and sisters, Heydrich came of age in a society that was systematically, if imperfectly, grappling with the crimes of the regime his father had helped lead. He attended school in a country that was beginning to confront what had happened. He bore a name that was increasingly associated not just with the general horror of Nazism, but with specific, documented, catastrophic crimes. The Wannsee Conference, the RSHA, the Protectorate, the Einsatzgruppen, the coordination of the Holocaust. These were not abstract historical facts, but biographical details about his father. Every book that mentioned these events, every history class that covered the final solution, every survivor testimony that described the machinery of persecution and murder was in some sense also a description of what his father had built and run. Reinhard Heydrich became, by all available accounts, a man who tried to lead an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary burden. He went into business and worked as an entrepreneur, spending much of his working life in the food industry in Germany. He settled in the Federal Republic and married, had children of his own, built what appears to have been by outward measures a private and relatively unremarkable bourgeois existence. But the question of his father was never far from the surface. In the 1960s, as the broader German society engaged in increasingly painful public debates about the Nazi past, individuals with the kind of direct family connection that Heydrich had could not easily remain invisible. His name appeared in books and newspaper articles about his father. He was contacted by journalists, historians, and filmmakers. He found himself having to navigate a relationship with his father's legacy that was far more complicated than simple acceptance or repudiation could resolve. In various interviews and public statements over the decades, Reinhard Heydrich occupied an unusual and in some ways uncomfortable position. He did not, like Gudrun Himmler, become a public defender of his father's ideology and memory, attending SS reunions and working through organizations like Stille Hilfe to support former perpetrators. But he also did not, like Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, become a fierce and unsparing public denouncer who wrote books cataloguing his father's crimes and expressed unambiguous contempt for what his father had done. His position was more ambivalent, more personal, more centered on the complexity of being a child who had loved a parent without knowing that parent as the world came to know him. In some interviews, he, in some, spoke with apparent sincerity about the difficulty of reconciling the father he remembered as a small child with the historical figure that the records revealed. He expressed what seemed to be genuine discomfort with the magnitude of his father's crimes. He acknowledged the historical reality of the Holocaust and did not attempt to minimize it in the way his mother had. But he was also protective of certain aspects of his personal memory, and his relationship with his father's legacy was never one of clean, uncomplicated condemnation. He maintained a certain distance from the most damning historical assessments, and this distance, whatever its psychological necessity, was something that critics found inadequate given the specific scale of what his father had done. What would it have meant for Heydrich to fully and publicly condemn his father? It would have meant saying, in effect, that the central figure of his early childhood, the person around whom his earliest memories were organized, was one of the most evil men who has ever lived. It would have meant accepting not just the abstract historical verdict, but the personal and emotional implications of that verdict. It would have meant the destruction of the only private image of a father that he had ever had, in favor of the public historical image that the world had constructed. For a person of conscience who also retained genuine childhood memories of a father's presence, this is an almost unimaginably difficult thing to do. It does not excuse the failure to do it fully, but it explains it. Heydrich lived to a remarkably advanced age. He was 86 years old when he died on December 24, 2020, dying on Christmas Eve, just one day after what would have been his 86th birthday on December 23rd. He had outlived his mother by 35 years, his brother Klaus by 77 years, and had lived long enough to see Reinhard Heydrich become one of the most studied and written about figures of the entire Nazi era, the subject of multiple full-length biographies, hundreds of academic papers, and numerous film and television productions. He had lived through the founding of the Federal Republic in 1949, through the construction and then the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, through the reunification of Germany in 1990, through the 60th, 70th, and 75th anniversaries of the end of the Second World War, each one bringing new waves of historical reflection and renewed scrutiny of the figures who had shaped that catastrophe. In his final years, Reinhard Heydrich reportedly lived a quiet and largely private life. The public appearances and interviews that had punctuated his middle years became rarer as he aged. He seems to have found, if not peace exactly, then at least a way of living with the weight he carried. The fact that he survived into the 21st century, dying in December 2020, meant that he was one of the last living direct connections to the world of the Nazi leadership, one of the last people who could say with literal biographical truth that Reinhard Heydrich had been a figure in his early childhood. When he died at the end of 2020, during the extraordinary isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic, a final thread connecting living personal memory to one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century was severed. The news of Reinhard Heydrich's death was noted in the German press with brief, factual reports. He was identified as the son of the assassinated Reich protector, his connection to one of the most notorious figures of the Nazi era, duly noted, and then the reports moved on. There was no great outpouring of public grief, no lengthy obituaries assessing his contribution to the public reckoning with the Nazi past, no monuments or memorials. He had lived and he had died, carrying his name and his history to the end, and the world noted his passing briefly and moved on to other things. There is something both fitting and slightly melancholy about this. A man who had spent his life trying to find a way to be simply himself, rather than merely his father's son, who died and was remembered primarily as his father's son. That was the final weight of the Heydrich inheritance. Of all Heydrich's children, Silke is the one about whom the public record is the sparsest, because she made the choice, more consistently than her brother Heydrich, to live entirely outside the public eye. Silke Heydrich was born on April 9, 1939, in the months before the outbreak of World War II, and was therefore just 3 years old when her father was assassinated in 1942, and just 6 years old when the war ended. The images that exist of her as a child show a girl photographed with her parents at official functions, part of the tableau of Nazi domesticity that the regime periodically presented to its population as evidence of its leaders' wholesome normalcy. After the war, she largely disappeared from the public record. She grew up in the Federal Republic, raised by Lena in the difficult post-war years and navigating the same challenges of name and identity that all of Heydrich's children faced. She appears to have made the consistent decision to seek and maintain maximum privacy. She gave virtually no interviews, made no public statements, and structured her life around keeping as great a distance as possible from the notoriety attached to her surname. The question of what it means to bear a name like Heydrich in post-war Germany is not a trivial one, and Silke would have encountered it at every stage of her life. In school, in professional contexts, in any situation where an introduction required her to say who she was. There is a particular quality of social invisibility that some survivors of the Nazi era and their children have cultivated as a survival strategy, a learned art of not being seen, of keeping a low profile, of avoiding any context where the name might be recognized and the questions asked that inevitably follow recognition. Whether Silke Heydrich changed her name at any point, whether she married and thereby acquired a different surname, whether she built a professional identity that did not require her to use the name Heydrich, these are questions that the available public record cannot definitively answer. What is clear is that she chose a path as different as possible from the conspicuous public engagement of her mother, Lena. Martha Heydrich, the youngest of the 4 children, occupies perhaps the most poignant position in the family story. Born on July 23, 1942, 6 weeks and more after her father died on June 4, 1942, she never saw him. She was not merely an infant who had lost her father at a young age, like Silke, who was 3 when Reinhard died. She was a child who was born into the already established absence of her father, a child for whom the word father was from the very beginning a category populated not by memory or experience, but only by story and history. She grew up without any personal memory of her father whatsoever, which means that her relationship to his legacy was always mediated entirely through other people's accounts, through her mother's highly partial and defensive narrative, through the historical record as it became available to her, through the relentless public interest in the man whose name she bore. In many ways, this made Marte's position even more complex than that of her siblings, who at least had some fragment of personal memory, however distant and childlike, to set against the overwhelming historical portrait. For Heydrich, even the faintest memory of her father's presence could be held against the historical record as a kind of countervailing personal testimony. For Marte, there was nothing to hold against it. The father she had was entirely constructed from outside. From Lena's stories, from history books, from documentaries and films, and the unending public examination of who Reinhard Heydrich had been. She had no private version of him that preceded the public one, because there had been no father before the historical figure. Not for her. She came into the world after the man was already gone. Like Silke, Marte largely avoided the public eye in her adult life. She grew up in the Federal Republic, raised by Lena, and navigated the same challenges that her surviving siblings faced. She too appears to have chosen a life that kept her out of the public gaze. The historical record illuminates the outlines of her situation without providing much specific detail about how she lived it. What we can say with confidence is that all 3 of the Heydrich daughters, born in 1939, 1942, and raised through the post-war decades, made the consistent choice of privacy over public engagement, of retreat over confrontation, of anonymous private lives over the conspicuous public profiles that their mother had carved out. Now let us step back from the immediate nuclear family and look at the other, members of the broader family circle who were also affected by the consequences of Reinhard Heydrich's life and death. His mother, Elisabeth Maria Heydrich née Krantz, born in 1879, had grown up in the musical household that she and her husband Bruno had created together in Halle. She was an accomplished piano teacher, a woman of culture and middle-class respectability, who had raised 3 children in the conservative, nationally minded milieu of the German bourgeoisie. Bruno Heydrich, the father, had died in 1938, the year before the war began, and therefore never saw where his son's career would ultimately lead. Bruno had been a complex figure himself, a talented musician and conservatory founder who had, in his professional life, faced the same kinds of anti-Semitic prejudice that was endemic in German musical culture of the late 19th and early 20th century, and who had been subject to rumours about his own racial background that would later torment his far more powerful son. There had been, throughout Reinhard Heydrich's lifetime, persistent rumours that the Heydrich family had Jewish ancestry. The rumours centred on Bruno Heydrich's birth name and the circumstances of the family's origins in the German-speaking communities of Central Europe. They circulated widely within the Nazi Party and caused Heydrich himself considerable anxiety, not because he believed them to be necessarily true, but because in the insane logic of the Third Reich, even an unsubstantiated allegation of Jewish ancestry could be politically and personally catastrophic for a senior SS leader. Heydrich commissioned extensive genealogical research to disprove the claims, and the official record was eventually certified as showing no Jewish heritage. Himmler personally vouched for Heydrich's Aryan credentials. But the rumours never entirely died away, and they added a particularly cruel dimension to the family's situation. Here was a man who had devoted his professional life to persecuting and ultimately murdering Jewish people, who lived with the permanent possibility that history might record him as having been among those he was destroying. The psychological dimensions of this situation have fascinated historians and psychologists for decades. Some have argued that Heydrich's extraordinary viciousness toward Jewish people was partly driven by these rumours, that his persecution was in some sense an attempt to inoculate himself against the accusation of Jewishness by making himself the most conspicuous possible persecutor. Whether or not this psychoanalytic interpretation is valid, it adds another layer of terrible irony to the history of the Heydrich family. The man who helped build the machinery of the Holocaust may have been partly driven by anxieties about his own identity that, in a world without Nazi racial ideology, would have been entirely irrelevant. Elisabeth Heydrich, Reinhard's mother, died in 1943 while the war was still ongoing. She died before the liberation, before the trials, before the full public reckoning with what Reinhard had done. In one sense, this spared her the worst of the post-war exposure. She did not live to see the Nuremberg trials, the detailed documentation of the Wannsee Conference, or the systematic presentation of evidence showing exactly what the RSHA, under her son's leadership, had organized and carried out. But she had lived long enough to see him rise to the pinnacle of power, to know that her son was one of the most feared men in Europe, and to grieve his assassination in 1942. She had attended his state funeral. She had mourned the death of her grandson Klaus. She died as one of the millions of Germans who lived and died in the shadow of what the regime they had supported or acquiesced in was doing, without ever fully reckoning with its consequences. The fate of Heydrich's brother Heinz Siegfried Heydrich, born in 1905, brings us to another dimension of the family's wartime experience. Heinz was the elder sibling, a year older than Reinhard, and the brother with whom Reinhard would have grown up most closely in the musical Halle household. Like Reinhard, he served in the German military during the Third Reich, though he never attained anything like his younger brother's prominence or power. He was not a member of the SS elite, not a figure in the upper reaches of the Nazi state. He served in the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, and was eventually deployed to the Eastern Front, that most terrible theatre of the entire war, where the fighting was of a ferocity and brutality unmatched anywhere else in the conflict. Germany lost over 2 million men on the Eastern Front, in dead alone, with millions more wounded, captured, or missing. Heinz Heydrich died in action on the Eastern Front in 1944. He was one of the millions of Germans who were consumed by the catastrophe that Nazi Germany had unleashed on the Soviet Union, dying in a war that his younger brother had helped to plan and prosecute in the most lethal theatre of that war. The death of Heinz left the Heydrich family without its two eldest males. Reinhard had been killed in 1942, Heinz died in 1944, and Bruno Sr. had died in 1938. The family's male line had been essentially eliminated by the catastrophe of the war. The surviving members, Lena with her children and the sister Marita, were left to face the post-war world in circumstances that were both materially difficult and psychologically oppressive. Marita Heydrich, Reinhard's sister, led a more obscure existence after the war and left even less of a trace in the historical record than her brothers had. She too carried the name and the history, in a generation that was already somewhat removed from the direct question of perpetration, though not from the question of proximity and association. The Czech dimension of the Heydrich family's post-war story extends beyond the expulsion from Panenské Břežany to the question of how the Heydrich legacy was treated in Czechoslovakia and later in the Czech Republic over the following decades. For the Czechs, Heydrich was and remains one of the most hated figures in their modern history, a foreign oppressor whose rule was characterized by terror, deportation, and murder, and whose assassination was one of the most dramatic and celebrated acts of resistance of the entire war. The memory of Lidis, the village destroyed in reprisal for his death, became a central element of Czech national identity and of the broader global memory of Nazi barbarity. After the war, the Czech government undertook extensive efforts to document and commemorate the crimes of the occupation and the heroism of the resistance. The Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius, where the paratroopers made their last stand, was restored and made into a memorial. The bullet marks from the June 18, 1942 battle were preserved in the church walls as a permanent memorial to the courage of Gabčík, Kubiš and their comrades. A museum in the crypt commemorates both the paratroopers and the Czech civilians who helped them at the cost of their own lives. The site became and remains one of the most significant memorial spaces in Prague, drawing thousands of visitors each year and serving as a permanent reminder of what the Nazi occupation had meant and what it had cost to resist it. The rebuilt village of Lidis, which rose from the ashes in the years after the war through a combination of national determination and international solidarity, became one of the most symbolically important memorial sites in all of post-war Europe. The original village site was preserved as a memorial garden, with a rose garden containing roses donated by individuals and organizations from around the world, and a haunting bronze sculpture depicting the 82 Lidis children who were taken by the Nazis and killed. The names of all the Lidis victims are recorded on memorial plaques. New village was built nearby, and the surviving women who returned from Ravensbrück concentration camp rebuilt their community there, determined to prove that the Nazis' attempt at erasure had failed. Lidis lives runs the slogan that became the village's post-war motto, and it does as a community, as a memorial, and as a symbol. For the Heydrich family, and particularly for the children who grew up in post-war Germany learning about the Second World War, the name Lidisser must have had a particular resonance and a particular weight. The connection between their father's death and the destruction of Lidis was direct, documented, and inescapable. It could not be explained away or minimized. Even Lena Heydrich, who was prepared to minimize or deny virtually everything else associated with her husband's record, doesn't appear to have attempted to challenge the historical account of the Lidissee massacre. That was too well documented, too thoroughly established, too viscerally present in the public consciousness to be argued with. The children of Reinhard Heydrich grew up knowing that their father's assassination had been the direct cause of the murder of hundreds of Czech civilians, including 82 children. How that knowledge sits alongside any private memory of a father or any sense of personal identity is something that no outside observer can fully imagine. Let us now turn to consider the broader historical context of how Germany's relationship with the Nazi past has evolved, because this evolution shaped the conditions in which the Heydrich family lived and defined what was expected of them at each stage. In the 1950s, West Germany was a society in which the instinct to look forward rather than backward dominated. The pressing priorities of reconstruction, of building democratic institutions, of integrating the Federal Republic into the Western Alliance, and of dealing with the social and economic dislocations of the post-war period, all pushed against. Sustained national self-examination. The denazification process had been wound down with considerable incompleteness. The Nuremberg trials had dealt with the senior leadership, but the vast middle management of the Nazi terror apparatus had largely been reintegrated into German society, often with remarkable ease and speed. Former Nazis served in the judiciary, in the civil service, in academia, in business, and in politics. The first Chancellor of the Federal Republic, Konrad Adenauer, had himself been persecuted by the Nazis, which gave him a kind of moral authority on the question of confronting the past. But many of the men he appointed to senior government positions had Nazi records of varying degrees of severity. This was not a secret exactly, but it was not a subject of sustained public debate in the early years of the Federal Republic either. The dominant social convention was a kind of collective amnesia, a tacit agreement that whatever had happened during the Nazi years should be left behind so that the new Germany could focus on the present. For the Heydrich family, this culture of amnesia was in some respects convenient. It created a social space in which a widow of a Nazi war criminal could live without constant public stigma, in which her children could attend school and pursue careers without being systematically confronted with their father's history. But it also meant that the reckoning that would eventually come arrived with greater force and disruption precisely because it had been so long delayed. When the German student movements of the late 1960s erupted partly in protest against the incomplete nature of the post-war reckoning with Nazism, when the Frankfurt-Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965 brought the specific horror of the death camps into German consciousness in unprecedented detail, when the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 created a global media event around the mechanisms of the Holocaust, the Heydrich children were middle-aged adults. They had grown up in the relative shelter of the 1950s consensus, and now they found themselves in a Germany that was increasingly, sometimes painfully, unwilling to maintain that shelter. The impact of the Eichmann trial deserves particular mention in the context of the Heydrich family. Adolf Eichmann had been one of Heydrich's most important subordinates, the man responsible for coordinating the logistics of the deportations of Jews to the death camps. He had attended the Wannsee conference, been present for Heydrich's chairing of that meeting, and had been one of the key operational executives of the final solution under Heydrich's authority. Eichmann's capture in Argentina by Israeli Mossad agents in May 1960, his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, and his execution in 1962 were all major international events that brought Heydrich's name back into prominent public discussion. The trial produced extensive documentary evidence and eyewitness testimony about the precise mechanics of the Holocaust, and Heydrich figured prominently in that evidence as Eichmann's superior and the architect of the system Eichmann had implemented. For Haider and his sisters, the Eichmann trial would have represented another wave of public attention to their father's legacy, another surge of historical documentation and public discussion about exactly what Reinhard Heydrich had done. The 1960s and 1970s were decades in which this pattern repeated itself regularly: the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, the publication of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, with its influential concept of the banality of evil, the student movement's demands for public accounting from the older generation, the publication of major historical works on the Holocaust and on specific Nazi leaders, all brought Heydrich's name into circulation repeatedly and in ever more detailed and damning contexts. The publication of Robert Gellatly's work and, most significantly, Günther Deschner's 1977 biography, Heydrich, The Pursuit of Total Power, provided thorough and well-sourced historical assessments of Heydrich's career that systematically demolished any remaining claim that he had been merely a professional functionary rather than a driving ideological force behind the Holocaust. These works drew on the extensive documentary record that had survived the war, including the minutes of the Wannsee Conference, the communications of the RSHA, the reports of the Einsatzgruppen, and the testimony of numerous witnesses and survivors. They presented Heydrich not as a man who had been swept along by historical forces larger than himself, but as a man who had actively sought, created, and expanded his role as a killer who had been drawn to the SS and to the work of persecution and murder, not reluctantly, but eagerly, who had been, in the fullest sense, a willing and enthusiastic perpetrator. Against this accumulating historical record, Lena's 1976 memoir stood as a monument to denial. The book was not simply wrong in its details, though it was wrong in many of its specific claims. It was wrong in its fundamental premise, that Reinhard Heydrich's historical reputation was the product of post-war Allied propaganda and German self-flagellation, rather than of documented historical reality. The historical record that had been assembled by the time Lena's book was published was overwhelming in its scope and detail. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference alone, with Heydrich's name on every page as the convener and chair, were sufficient to establish his central role in the coordination of the Holocaust. No amount of personal testimonial from a devoted widow could alter that record. But Lena's book, precisely because it was so conspicuously at odds with the historical consensus, illuminated something important about the psychological and social world that the families of Nazi perpetrators inhabited. The gap between the private memory of a person and the public, historical record of what that person did, is a gap that many people find it impossible to bridge, especially when the public record is as catastrophic as Reinhard Heydrich's. The temptation to defend the private memory, to argue that the person you knew could not have been the monster that history describes, is understandable, even when it is ultimately inexcusable. Lena Heydrich gave in to that temptation with unusual thoroughness and public determination. Her children, particularly Haider, seem to have found ways of partially resisting it without ever fully overcoming it. As we approach the end of our examination of the Heydrich family and its post-war fates, it is worth considering how the broader question of memory and accountability, as it applies specifically to this family, fits into the larger question of how Germany has dealt with the legacies of its most notorious criminals. Germany has, over the post-war decades, developed some of the most extensive and thoughtful approaches to historical accountability and memorial culture of any nation that has ever had to reckon with its own atrocities. The Wannsee Conference House, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the documentation centers in Nuremberg and other cities, the extensive network of concentration camp memorials, the mandatory inclusion of Holocaust education in the school curriculum, all of these represent genuine, ongoing, and in many respects admirable commitments to confronting the past rather than forgetting it. But the families of perpetrators occupy a complicated position within this broader culture of accountability. They are not themselves the perpetrators. They did not make the decisions, give the orders, or carry out the murders, yet they are directly connected to the people who did, and that connection has consequences. The question of what is owed to history by the children and grandchildren and siblings of mass murderers is one that German society has been working through for the better part of 80 years and has not yet fully resolved. Some members of perpetrator families, like Niklas Frank and Katrin Himmler, the great-niece of Heinrich Himmler who wrote extensively about her family's history, have chosen active public engagement, treating the family history as a responsibility to expose and confront, rather than a shameful secret to bury. Others, like most of Heydrich's own children, have chosen the path of private withdrawal. Both choices have their defenders and their critics. Those who defend public engagement point out that the children and grandchildren of perpetrators are uniquely positioned to contribute to historical understanding, precisely because of their family connection. They have access to personal memories, family documents, and perspectives that cannot be obtained from any other source. Their willingness to engage publicly and honestly is, in this view, a moral and civic responsibility. Those who defend private withdrawal argue that individuals cannot be held accountable for the crimes of their relatives, that the demand for perpetual public engagement is itself a form of punishment, being inflicted on people for something they did not do, and that the right to a private life is not forfeited by the accident of birth. The Heydrich family, in the choices its surviving members made over the post-war decades, navigated this tension in ways that reflected their individual personalities, circumstances, and perhaps most significantly, the powerful influence of Lena's unrepentant public stance. If the dominating figure in the family had chosen a different path, had herself engaged with the historical record honestly and expressed genuine remorse, the children might have been freed to do the same. Instead, they grew up in a household where denial was the norm, where the historical consensus was challenged rather than accepted, and where the social world reinforced rather than challenged the defensive narrative. That they emerged from this environment without becoming, as their mother had been, active participants in the broader network of Nazi apologia is perhaps the most that could reasonably have been expected of them. The Czech Republic, the country that bears the most direct and painful connection to Heydrich's crimes, has maintained its memory of the assassination and its aftermath with particular care. The annual commemorations at the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius, the maintenance of the Lidis Memorial and the rebuilt village, the extensive documentation of the occupation years in Czech museums and archives, all of these represent a sustained national commitment to remembering what happened. The relationship between these acts of Czech memory and the existence of the Heydrich family somewhere in Germany is not one that the Czech institutions explicitly address, but it is present as an implicit dimension of the memorial work. The village of Lidis was destroyed in the name of the man, whose family survived the war. The 82 children of Lidis died so that the Nazi regime could respond to the killing of their killer. These are facts that the memorial landscape of Bohemia and Moravia makes impossible to forget. The assassination of Heydrich has been the subject of numerous films, novels, and theatrical productions over the decades, and each new cultural treatment of the story brings renewed attention to the man and to the family he left behind. The 1975 Czech film Attentat was an early attempt to dramatize the assassination for a Czech audience. The 2016 British film Anthropoid, with Cillian Murphy as Josef Gabčík and Jamie Dornan as Jan Kubiš, brought the story to a large international audience with considerable historical accuracy. A French-Czech production released in 2017, The Man with the Iron Heart, based on a novel by Laurent Binet, covered both Heydrich's rise to power and the assassination, presenting him as a complex and terrifying figure. Each of these productions renewed public interest in the entire story, including in the family that Heydrich left behind. The 2011 novel by Laurent Binet, H.O. which stood for Himmler's Hirn heißt Heydrich, meaning Himmler's brain is called Heydrich, was an international literary sensation that won the Prix Goncourt du Premier Roman in France and was translated into many languages. It combined meticulous historical research with a self-reflective narrative voice that explicitly addressed the difficulty of writing about historical events of this magnitude, and it introduced Reinhard Heydrich to a new generation of readers who might not have encountered him through traditional history books. For the Heydrich family, wherever they were living their private lives, the appearance of a best-selling literary novel bearing their father's name and a title that quoted one of his nicknames was another iteration of the experience they had been having for decades, the world's fascination. With Reinhard Heydrich did not diminish with time. It grew. It is worth asking, in the context of all these cultural productions, what Heydrich Heydrich thought of them. He was alive for most of them, and presumably aware of them, given the prominence of his surname and the near certainty that friends, acquaintances, journalists and strangers made him aware of each new film or book about his father. Whether he watched the films, read the novels, engaged with the historical literature, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that his response, insofar as it is documented, was to maintain his characteristic ambivalence, neither embracing the historical verdict fully nor publicly challenging it in the way his mother had. He seems to have watched from the sidelines as his father's story was told and retold, finding no version that fully matched his own private understanding of who his father had been, and choosing not to add his own public contribution to the contested record. Now, as we draw toward the conclusion of this examination of the Heydrich family's post-war lives, let us reflect on what these individual stories, taken together, tell us about the aftermath of atrocity. The story of Reinhard Heydrich's family is, in one sense, just one of thousands of similar stories from the Nazi era. The story of a family caught in the wake of an extraordinary and terrible career, trying to live with consequences they did not create and could not escape. But it is also a particularly illuminating story because of the specific magnitude of Heydrich's crimes and the specific choices that the most prominent surviving member, Lena, made in response to those crimes. Lena Heydrich's story is, at its core, a story about the refusal to reckon. She lived through the post-war decades in a state of sustained denial, building a worldview in which her husband's crimes were minimized, misrepresented, or attributed to forces beyond his control, and in which the historical consensus was a form of politically motivated persecution rather than a reflection of documented reality. That worldview, which she expressed publicly and maintained privately until her death in August 1985, shaped the world in which her children grew up and coloured their own attempts to relate to the history they had inherited. It was, in the end, a form of damage that Lena inflicted on her own children, because the denial that protected her from the full weight of the truth left them without a framework for honest engagement with a reality they could not entirely avoid. Heydrich, who lived the longest of Lena's children, and who left the most extensive public record, seems to have spent his long life trying to find a way between his mother's denial and the full embrace of historical condemnation, and never quite finding it. Silke and Marte, who had even less of a direct personal connection to their father, seem to have found their way to a private equilibrium that allowed them to live their lives without being consumed by the history of their name. The children of Klaus, who died before he could face the post-war reckoning, were spared it entirely. And Lena herself, who faced it most squarely and most publicly, met it with a defiance that was, in its own terrible way, utterly consistent with the ideology she had chosen and the man she had loved. What, in the end, did justice look like for the family of Reinhard Heydrich? It did not look like a war crimes trial, because Lena was not prosecuted. It did not look like the payment of reparations to the families of the victims, because no such obligation was imposed. It did not look like public contrition, because Lena refused it, and her children mostly avoided it. What justice looked like, insofar as it looked like anything, was the slow, grinding weight of history, the accumulation of documented evidence, the growing public awareness of what Heydrich had done, the memorials to his victims, the films and books and museum exhibits that made his crimes impossible to forget or to minimize. That is a form of justice, however incomplete, however inadequate to the magnitude of the crimes. The victims of Reinhard Heydrich, the murdered Jews of Europe, the destroyed villages of Lidis and Ležáky, the Czechs who died in the reprisal killings, the political opponents tortured and murdered by the Gestapo and SD under his authority. Their memory has been preserved and honoured by the historical record in ways that no amount of revisionist memoir writing could erase. And the family he left behind, the widow who refused to repent, the brother who died on the Eastern Front, the mother who died before the full reckoning arrived, and the children who tried to live their lives in the shadow of the man who was their father, were left to carry that name through the decades, finding different ways to manage the weight of it, none of them finding a way that was fully satisfactory, and all of them, in the end, simply doing what human beings do in impossible situations: surviving, adapting, and carrying on. The final word on Reinhard Heydrich's family, as on the man himself, belongs not to any of them, but to the historical record, to the minutes of the Wannsee Conference, to the testimonies of the survivors, to the rebuilt village of Lidis, and to the bullet marks still visible in the walls of a church in Prague, where men died trying to undo some small fragment of the evil he had done. There is one aspect of the Heydrich story that has not yet received the full attention it deserves in this examination: the question of what happened to the properties, the possessions, and the assets that Reinhard Heydrich had accumulated during his years of power, and how those assets were dealt with in the aftermath of the war. This is not merely an academic question about property law. It is a question that goes to the heart of how societies reckon with the material benefits that perpetrators extracted from their victims and whether any meaningful restitution can be achieved. In the case of the Heydrich family, the property question intersected with the pension question in ways that illuminate the broader landscape of post-war German attempts at, and failures of, material accountability. The Panenske Brzeżany estate, as has been noted, had been the property of the Bloch-Bauer family before the Nazi occupation. The Bloch-Bauers were a prominent Jewish industrial family from Bohemia with extensive business interests and considerable social standing. They had been among the first wave of people dispossessed when the Nazi occupation machinery began operating in the Protectorate. Their estate was appropriated and assigned to Heydrich when he arrived as Reich Protector, providing him and his family with the grand country residence appropriate to his status. When Lena was expelled from Czechoslovakia in 1945, the estate reverted to Czech state ownership, and the Bloch-Bauer family's efforts to reclaim it were complicated by both the post-war Czech nationalization policies and later by the communist period in Czechoslovakia, which nationalized virtually all private property regardless of its origin. The broader Bloch-Bauer family story intersects in a remarkable and ironic way with another famous restitution case that would eventually capture global attention, the Klimt paintings case. Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer had been the patron and subject of Gustav Klimt's famous 1907 Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, often called the Woman in Gold. His niece, Maria Altmann, spent years fighting the Austrian government for the return of the Klimt paintings that had been seized from the family during the Nazi period. Her eventual success in a case that went to the United States Supreme Court and resulted in the return of the paintings to her in 2006 became the subject of a major film. The Panenske Brzeżany estate itself was a separate and less celebrated dimension of the Bloch-Bauer dispossession, but it was part of the same pattern of Nazi theft that the Klimt case brought to international attention. The fact that Lena Heydrich had been living on property stolen from a family whose cultural treasures would eventually become the subject of a landmark restitution case is one of those historical ironies that underlines the interconnectedness of the Nazi crimes and their long aftermath. When Lena and her children left Panenske Brzeżany in 1945, they took with them whatever personal possessions they could carry, and they left behind not only the estate itself, but a particular chapter of their lives. The Czech village of Panenske Brzeżany, which had been dominated by the presence of the Reich Protector's family during the occupation years, gradually reclaimed its own identity in the post-war period. Local residents who had been compelled to interact with the Heydrichs during the occupation years to provide labour for the estate, or to navigate the administrative demands of the occupation, now had to make sense of that period in their own terms. The legacy of having had Heydrich's family as their neighbours, however involuntarily, was a dimension of the local memory that persisted for decades. The estate itself went through various uses in the post-war and communist periods, serving different institutional functions before eventually becoming a site of historical interest in the context of the growing Czech tourism around Second World War memorial sites. Today, visitors to the Czech Republic who are interested in the history of the Nazi occupation can travel to Panenske Brzeżany and stand on the grounds where Lena Heydrich managed her household, while her husband's administration was coordinating deportations and executions across the Protectorate. The physical place survives as a kind of accidental memorial to the specific personal geography of that evil. Let us now turn to an aspect of the story that deserves fuller consideration: the question of how the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich was received and understood within Germany itself, both at the time and in the decades that followed. In 1942, the Nazi propaganda machine presented Heydrich's death as a martyrdom, an act of cowardly murder by agents of British imperialism and Jewish revenge, as the regime's rhetoric framed it. The state funeral was a propaganda exercise as much as a personal tribute, designed to demonstrate that even the most beloved and powerful Nazi heroes could be struck down by the enemies of the Reich, and that the German people should respond not with doubt or despair, but with renewed determination and fury. The reprisals at Lidis and Ležáky were presented to the German public as the proper response, as demonstrations of the strength and resolve that the assassination was intended to undermine. How ordinary Germans responded to the assassination and to the reprisals is a question that historians have examined in some detail, and the answers are complicated. There were certainly Germans who were privately relieved at Heydrich's death, who regarded him as one of the most feared and dangerous figures in the entire Nazi apparatus, a man whose power over ordinary German citizens as well as over the occupied peoples was terrifying. The Gestapo, which he had controlled, was a source of fear throughout German society, not only in the occupied territories but in Germany itself, and there were Germans who were privately horrified by the reprisals at Lidis and Ležáky, who understood that the murder of an entire village was a crime of enormous proportions regardless of the justifications offered. But public opposition was, in 1942, essentially impossible in Nazi Germany. Whatever private thoughts Germans had about Heydrich's death or about the reprisals, they were expressed in private, if at all, and the public sphere was entirely controlled by the propaganda apparatus that mourned Heydrich as a hero and presented the reprisals as justice. In the years after the war, German public memory of the assassination and its aftermath went through several phases. In the 1940s and 1950s, as with so much of the Nazi past, it was largely suppressed or avoided. In the 1960s and beyond, as the broader reckoning with the Nazi past intensified, the specific story of Heydrich and the assassination began to receive more public attention. Czech accounts of the occupation, which were more freely published after the fall of communism in 1989, added new dimensions to the story from the perspective of those who had lived under Heydrich's rule. One of the specific post-war legal proceedings that touched on the Heydrich legacy deserves careful attention. The trial of Karl Hermann Frank, the German State Secretary of Bohemia and Moravia, who had been Heydrich's principal subordinate in the Protectorate and who had coordinated the reprisal actions at Lidis and elsewhere after the assassination. Frank was captured by American forces at the end of the war and handed over to the Czechoslovak authorities, who tried him in Prague in 1946. He was charged with war crimes relating to his role in the Protectorate, including the Lidis massacre and the broader reprisal killings following Heydrich's assassination. Frank was found guilty and executed by hanging in Prague on May 22, 1946, before a crowd of thousands of Czech citizens who had come to witness the execution of one of the most hated figures of the occupation. Frank's trial was important not only as an act of justice but as a documentation of the crimes of the Protectorate administration. The evidence presented at his trial included detailed accounts of the Lidis massacre, of the broader reprisal killings, and of the administrative structure through which these crimes had been coordinated. Heydrich, being dead, was not in the dock, but his shadow was present throughout the proceedings. The evidence that documented Frank's crimes simultaneously documented the system that Heydrich had built and that Frank had continued to operate after the assassination. The Frank trial thus contributed to the historical record of what the Protectorate had been and what Heydrich's role in its crimes had been, even though Heydrich himself was not prosecuted. For Lena Heydrich, who was in Germany during the Frank trial, the proceedings in Prague were presumably followed with considerable attention. The man who had been her husband's closest colleague in the Protectorate, the man who had organised the reprisals for Reinhard's assassination, was being tried and ultimately executed. The evidence being presented in that Prague courtroom was evidence of a system that her husband had designed and that Frank had implemented under his authority. The connection was direct and undeniable. Yet from Lena's perspective, this was presumably just another iteration of the unfair persecution of Germans who had done their duty to their country, a framing that was deeply wrong, but that was consistent with the worldview she maintained. Now, there is an interesting and somewhat overlooked dimension of the Heydrich family story that relates to the question of Reinhard Heydrich's personal beliefs and motivations, and whether anyone in his family ever grappled seriously with the question of how those beliefs had been formed and what they had led to. The conventional historical account presents Heydrich as a convinced believer in National Socialist ideology who found in the SS and the security services a perfect outlet for his ambitions and his worldview. He was not, in this account, a reluctant functionary who was drawn into criminal activity by circumstances. He was an eager participant who drove the criminal activity forward. The evidence for this interpretation is overwhelming, from his early and enthusiastic embrace of the SS, to his leadership of the Einsatzgruppen operations, to his chairing of the Wannsee Conference. But there is also a strand of historical inquiry that has examined the specific personal and psychological factors that may have shaped Heydrich's career, And among these factors, the question of his early life and family background is not entirely irrelevant. Growing up in a musical, cultured household in Halle, attending a conservative secondary school, being shaped by the post-World War I German world of defeat, humiliation, and economic chaos. All of these are factors that historians have examined in trying to understand how a gifted, intelligent young man could have become one of the most dedicated murderers in history. The answer, as most serious historians conclude, lies not in any specific childhood trauma or family dysfunction, but in the broader cultural and ideological context of Weimar Germany, in which the ideology of racial nationalism found a receptive audience among exactly the kind of young, ambitious, frustrated men that Heydrich represented. For the family he left behind, the question of what had made Reinhard Heydrich who he was is not merely academic. It is personal. To understand how a man becomes capable of chairing a meeting at which the murder of 11 million people is coordinated, one has to grapple with questions of upbringing, ideology, social environment, and personal character that touch directly on the family that shaped him. Lena's response to this question was, essentially, to deny its premises. In her account, Reinhard had not become a mass murderer, because he had not been a mass murderer. He had been a professional who did his duty. This answer, which required the wholesale rejection of an overwhelming historical record, was the only answer that her psychology could apparently accommodate. Heider's response seems to have been more complicated. An acknowledgement that something terrible had happened, a personal discomfort with the specifics of what his father had done, and an unwillingness to fully follow through on the implications of that discomfort to the point of public and unequivocal condemnation. Whether this represents a moral failure, a psychological limitation, or simply the most human possible response to an impossible situation is a question that different people will answer differently. What it does not represent is an active engagement with the kind of historical accounting that the scale of Reinhard Heydrich's crimes would seem to demand. The story of the Heydrich family has also been implicitly engaged with in a broader cultural conversation about how Germany as a whole has come to terms with the Nazi past. Germany today is widely regarded as one of the most successful examples in modern history of a nation confronting and accounting for its own atrocities. The memorials, the museums, the legal prohibitions on Holocaust denial, the mandatory Holocaust education, the extensive reparations programs, the diplomatic and moral commitments to Israel. All of these represent a national commitment to accountability that is genuinely impressive and that stands in stark contrast to the avoidance and denial of the immediate post-war years. And yet, as many historians and critics have pointed out, this national accountability sits alongside the private unaccountability of individual families like the Heydrichs, who were never compelled by any legal or social mechanism to fully reckon with the specific crimes of their specific relatives. This gap between national and familial accountability is one of the most interesting and unresolved aspects of Germany's relationship with the Nazi past. The Federal Republic has acknowledged and apologized for the Holocaust as a national collective crime. It has paid billions in reparations to survivors and to Israel. It has enshrined the memory of the victims in an extensive infrastructure of memorials and institutions. But it has not, and perhaps cannot, compel the individual families of perpetrators to engage honestly with what their fathers and grandfathers did. The choice of how to live with a perpetrator's legacy remains, in the end, a private one, and the choices made by Lena Heydrich and by her children were their own, made in the specific circumstances of their specific lives. What remains, after tracing all these individual stories, is the question of legacy in its broadest sense. What is the legacy of Reinhard Heydrich's family in the world today? The immediate answer is very little that is publicly visible. The name Heydrich appears in history books and in the memorials to his victims, but not in any active public sphere. His surviving descendants, whoever and wherever they are, have largely chosen the path of anonymity and private life that most of the perpetrators' children ultimately chose. There are no Heydrichs who are prominent in German public life, no figures who have used the name to engage publicly with its history, no foundations or institutions that bear the name and work to address the legacy it carries. The family has, in this sense, receded from public history, even as the man himself remains a central figure in it. The most enduring legacy of the Heydrich family is perhaps the one that Lena created inadvertently with her legal battles and her memoir. a set of legal precedents and public controversies that contributed, however obliquely, to Germany's ongoing wrestling with the question of how to deal with the material and legal afterlives of Nazism. The pension cases, the denazification proceedings, the property restitution questions that her situation exemplified, these were not unique to her, but she was one of the most visible and persistent litigants, and the outcomes of her cases contributed to the broader legal framework that subsequently developed. In this specific, bureaucratic, and distinctly unglamorous way, Lena Heydrich's post-war struggles had a legacy beyond her own family, however different from the legacy she intended. But the deeper and more significant legacy is, of course, the memory of the crimes themselves and of the victims. The memorial at Lidis, where roses bloom in the garden dedicated to the murdered children of the village, carries a legacy that will outlast anything the Heydrich family ever said or did in the post-war decades. The Wannsee Conference House in Berlin, where visitors can read the minutes of the meeting Heydrich chaired and contemplate the bureaucratic planning of genocide, preserves a legacy of historical truth that no revisionist memoir can challenge. The Church of Saints, Cyril and Methodius in Prague, with its bullet-marked walls and its crypt memorial, preserves the legacy of those who had the courage to strike back against one of the Holocaust's architects at the cost of their own lives and the lives of those who helped them. These memorials are the truest legacy of what the Heydrich story means. They exist not to remember Reinhard Heydrich, but to remember his victims and those who resisted him. They exist as permanent refutations of the denial and revisionism that Lena Heydrich spent her life promoting, and they exist as places where the weight of history can be felt and contemplated by anyone who has the courage to look at it directly, a courage that, in the end, the Heydrich family itself was largely unable to summon. The question of whether the children of Reinhard Heydrich, in their long lives in post-war Germany, ever visited these memorials, ever stood at the site of Lidis or in the crypt of the Prague church or at the Wannsee Conference House, is one that the historical record cannot definitively answer. Perhaps they did privately, anonymously, without announcing themselves. Perhaps the weight of the name they carried drove them away from such places. Perhaps they found their own private ways of acknowledging what their father had done, ways that were not publicly visible but that represented some form of personal reckoning, or perhaps, as seems most likely. Given everything we know about the environment in which they were raised and the choices they made, they simply tried to live their lives as normally as possible and to keep as great a distance as they could from the history that their name connected them to. Whatever the truth of their private reckonings, the public record shows us a family that was, in its different members, representative of the broad range of responses to an impossible inheritance. Lena, the defiant widow. Heide, the ambivalent survivor. Silke and Marthe, the daughters who chose silence. Heinz, the brother consumed by the war. Klaus, the boy who died before the full weight could fall on him. Elizabeth, the mother who died before the full accounting arrived. Each of their stories, considered individually, is a human story of loss and survival, and the difficult attempt to make sense of one's place in a history that one did not choose. Considered together, they compose a picture of what the aftermath of extraordinary evil looks like when viewed from the inside of the family that bore the evildoer's name. It is a picture that should neither excuse nor simply condemn. The Heydrich family were, in various degrees and at various stages, shaped by, complicit in, damaged by, and ultimately trapped by the legacy of the man who was their husband and father and brother and son. They did not commit his crimes, but they inhabited the world those crimes created, and their responses to that world were part of the broader story of how Germany and the world reckoned with the Holocaust. The story of what happened to Reinhard Heydrich's family after World War II is, in the end, a story about the long reach of evil and the complicated, incomplete, and always insufficient ways in which its aftermath is lived and survived. In the years since Heide Heydrich's death in December 2020, the living link between the Heydrich family and anyone who can claim direct personal memory of Reinhard Heydrich has been effectively severed. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference, if they exist and wherever they live their private lives, are now members of a generation for whom their great-grandfather is as much a historical figure as he is a family ancestor. The personal memory, always fragmentary and always contested, has given way entirely to the historical record. That record is overwhelming. thoroughly documented and irrefutable. It tells the story of a man who was one of the primary architects of the most systematic program of murder in human history, who used the full administrative and coercive power of a modern state to organize and execute the killing of millions of people, and who was struck down at the age of 38 by men who were willing to sacrifice their own lives and the lives of those around them to stop him, or at least to make him pay. The family he left behind, the widow and the children and the siblings carried that history in their blood and their names for decades. They found different ways to manage it, none of them fully adequate to the magnitude of what they had inherited, all of them in some sense limited by the very enormity of the crimes and by the inadequacy of any possible private response to a public catastrophe of such scale. Reinhard Heydrich died in August 1985, still denying, still fighting, still the most conspicuous embodiment of a particular failure of moral reckoning. Her children lived longer and quieter lives, carrying the weight of their name into the 21st century, and then, one by one, laying it down. What they took with them when they went, what they made of the impossible hand they had been dealt, what peace or resolution or continued anguish they found in their private hearts, is something that history cannot tell us, and that perhaps was never meant to be told. There is a dimension of the Heydrich story that has been touched upon, but deserves deeper examination. The specific role that Heydrich played in the construction of the Einsatzgruppen and the mass murder operations in the Soviet Union that began in June 1941, and what those operations meant in terms of the documented evidence of his direct personal involvement in the most graphic dimensions of the Holocaust. Understanding this more fully helps us appreciate why the historical record is so unambiguous in its assessment of his role, and why the denial that characterized Lena's post-war narrative was so fundamentally at odds with what the documentary evidence shows. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, in what Hitler called Operation Barbarossa, it did so with a set of explicit directives that made clear the ideological character of the campaign. This was not to be a conventional war in the Western European sense. It was, in Hitler's conception and in the operational planning that flowed from it, a war of extermination, a racial war against what the Nazi ideology deemed the twin evils of Bolshevism and Jewish power. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that accompanied the advancing German forces into the Soviet Union, were organized specifically to carry out the mass murder of Jewish people, communist officials, Roma, and other groups designated as enemies. They were organized and controlled by the RSHA, which Heydrich led. The operational orders for the Einsatzgruppen were issued by Heydrich. The reports of their activities, the Ereignismeldungen or event reports, were submitted directly to him. He knew in meticulous detail what was being done in the name of orders he had given. By the time Heydrich died in June 1942, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered over 500,000 Jewish people in the Soviet Union, mainly in mass shootings at sites like Babi Yar outside Kiev, where on September 29th and 30th, 1941, more than 33,000 Jewish people were shot in a ravine over 2 days in one of the single largest mass murders of the entire Holocaust. The Ponary massacre near Vilnius in Lithuania, the Rumbula massacre outside Riga in Latvia, the Panerai forest killings. These mass murders, carried out by units under Heydrich's direct operational authority, were documented in the Ereignismeldungen that were submitted to his office. He read these reports. He signed off on the operations. He was not a distant bureaucrat who could plausibly claim ignorance of what was being done in the field under his orders. He was the man who had given those orders and who was receiving the reports of their execution. This is why the historical record is so definitive in its assessment of Heydrich and why Lena's counter-narrative was so fundamentally untenable. It was not a matter of disputed interpretation or conflicting evidence. The documents existed, they were captured intact when the war ended, they were presented at Nuremberg and have been examined by historians ever since. The chain of command from Heydrich's desk in Berlin to the killing sites in the Soviet Union was direct, documented, and traceable in meticulous administrative detail. The man who wrote those operational orders and received those killing reports was the same man whose violin playing moved audiences to tears, whose children he bounced on his knee at Panenske Brzezany, whose death Lena mourned in the summer of 1942. That these two realities could coexist in a single human being is one of the most disturbing facts that the Holocaust has forced us to confront. And it is a fact that the Heydrich family's post-war history never succeeded in either honestly engaging with or successfully obscuring. The Wannsee Conference itself, which has been mentioned several times in this examination, deserves a fuller description because its significance to the broader historical record and to the specific question of Heydrich's documented culpability is so fundamental. On January 20th, 1942, Heydrich convened a meeting at a villa in the Wannsee district of Berlin, a comfortable lakeside property that had been requisitioned from a Jewish businessman. 15 senior officials of the Nazi regime attended, representing various government ministries and the SS. The ostensible purpose of the conference was to coordinate the implementation of what Heydrich called the final solution of the Jewish question. The minutes of the meeting, which survived the war because copies were preserved in the German Foreign Ministry files, are one of the most significant historical documents of the entire Holocaust. The minutes, known as the Wannsee Protocol, record Heydrich's opening statement, in which he identified himself as having been authorized by Reichsmarschall Göring to make the necessary preparations for carrying out the final solution. He then presented, in bureaucratic language of extraordinary coldness, the scope of the task. The approximately 11 million Jews of Europe listed by country who were to be subjected to evacuation, the Nazi euphemism for deportation and murder. He outlined the logistics of the process, the gathering, the deportation, the labor utilization en route, and the ultimate fate of those who could not be put to work. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. There was no disagreement. The participants, representing the highest levels of the German governmental system, accepted Heydrich's coordination role and agreed on the administrative arrangements required. This meeting, which took place less than 5 months before Heydrich was assassinated, is documented with extraordinary precision. The protocol was recorded by Adolf Eichmann, who served as the meeting's secretary, and the copy that survived the war allows historians to identify exactly what was said, who was present, and what was agreed. Heydrich's central and authoritative role in the meeting is unmistakable. He was not one participant among equals. He was the convener, the chair, the man with the authority to coordinate across all the different government agencies represented, the man who had been given responsibility for the final solution by his superiors. The Wannsee Protocol is, in one document, a complete refutation of any claim that Heydrich was not the Holocaust's key administrative architect. For Lena to have written her 1976 memoir in the way she did, dismissing or minimizing this record, required either a comprehensive ignorance of the available evidence or a comprehensive willingness to deny it. Given her intelligence and her connections to the world of former Nazis, who had been deeply engaged with the evidence presented at the various post-war trials, the latter seems far more likely. She knew what the documents said. She had chosen not to believe them, or rather she had chosen to maintain a counter-narrative that served her psychological and ideological needs, regardless of what the documents said. This is not unusual human behavior exactly. People hold beliefs that are contradicted by evidence all the time when the evidence challenges something important enough to them. But in Lena's case, the gap between the maintained belief and the documented reality was so enormous, and the stakes so high that her persistence in denial takes on a quality that historians and psychologists have found both fascinating and horrifying. Let us now consider in somewhat greater depth the social world that Lena inhabited in post-war West Germany, because understanding that world helps explain how her denial was sustained and reinforced over decades. West Germany in the 1950s was, as historians have extensively documented, a society in which former Nazis were far more comprehensively reintegrated than the official rhetoric of denazification suggested. The Nuremberg trials had dealt with roughly 185 individuals, of whom only a fraction were sentenced to death or long prison terms. The vast majority of those who had participated at various levels in the Nazi state and its crimes had never faced any legal proceedings at all, and by the early 1950s, with the Cold War requiring West Germany as a stable, rearmed partner against the Soviet Union, the political will to pursue further prosecutions had largely evaporated. This meant that in the West German cities and towns of the 1950s, former SS members, former Gestapo officers, former administrators of the occupied territories, and former participants in the mass murder operations were living as ordinary citizens. Many had used the chaos of the immediate post-war period to obtain false or simplified documentation that obscured their wartime roles. Many had been classified at the lowest levels of the denazification process through the use of character witnesses, the so-called Persilscheine or whitewash certificates, provided by former colleagues or by obliging priests and community figures. Many had found their way back into professional positions, in the civil service, in the legal profession, in business, in academia. The extent of this reintegration was not fully understood by the West German public at the time, and it became one of the major revelations of the 1960s and 1970s as investigative journalists and academics began systematically documenting who had been who. For Lena Heydrich, living in this social world meant having access to a network of former colleagues, former SS members, former officials of the Protectorate and the RSHA, who shared her worldview and who reinforced her narrative about the war and its aftermath. She was not, in this network, regarded as the widow of a criminal, but as a figure of significance, the widow of one of the most senior and impressive members of the SS hierarchy, a woman of standing in the community of those who mourned the fallen Third Reich and regarded the post-war order as an unjust occupation, masquerading as liberation. These networks were not, for the most part, plotting the return of Nazism in any operational sense. They were, more mundanely, maintaining a social world, a set of friendships and connections and mutual support arrangements that allowed their members to live lives that were psychologically continuous with the world they had inhabited before 1945. The existence of these networks has been extensively documented by historians of the post-war period. Stille Hilfe, which has been mentioned in connection with both the Himmler and Heydrich families, was one of the most organized and persistent of these mutual support organizations. Founded in 1951 and initially chaired by Princess Marie Adelaide of Lippe, it provided legal assistance, financial support and practical help to former SS members who were facing denazification proceedings, war crimes investigations or imprisonment. Its membership list, which was never fully public, included some of the most prominent survivors of the SS elite and their families. Gudrun Himmler, who was not the daughter of a Heydrich but who shared with the Heydrich family the experience of having a father whose crimes were among the most extensively documented of any Nazi leader, became one of Stille Hilfe's most active participants, serving as its de facto leader for decades and earning the nickname Nazi Princess from critics. Lena Heydrich's connections to this world were real and documented, though her specific role in any organized activity was never as prominent as Gudrun Himmler's. She moved on the fringes of this community, attended gatherings, maintained correspondence, and was part of the broader social fabric of the post-war Nazi survivor network. Her book, when it was published in 1976, was received in certain circles of this network with something close to celebration. Here was the widow of one of the SS's most important figures, publicly challenging the historical consensus that condemned them all, demanding recognition for the professional service her husband had given, and refusing to accept the role of penitent that the post-war world seemed to demand. But outside these circles, the reaction was very different. German mainstream society by 1976 was not the amnesia-struck, forward-looking society of the 1950s. 2 decades of increasingly serious public reckoning with the Nazi past had produced a population that was, particularly in the younger generations, deeply uncomfortable with any form of Nazi apologia. The student movements of 1968 had made the question of parental and national guilt a central preoccupation of German cultural life. The Auschwitz trials had brought the specific horror of the death camps into national consciousness. Lena's book arrived in this context as something that much of the public found simply offensive, an attempt to rehabilitate a man who the historical record had comprehensively condemned by a woman who seemed not merely unrepentant but actively proud of what her husband had been. The reviews in mainstream German publications were, with few exceptions, damning. Critics pointed out the book's selective use of evidence, its minimization of documented crimes, and its fundamental dishonesty about what the historical record showed. Some reviewers expressed a kind of weary resignation that such a book had been published at all, seeing it as evidence that the reckoning with the Nazi past was still incomplete, and that the generation of direct participants and their families was still capable of producing apologia of this kind. Others were more sharply angry, seeing the book not merely as a personal statement by a grieving widow, but as a contribution to the broader project of Holocaust denial and historical revisionism that remained a live political danger. The publisher, Grabert Verlag, was itself a publisher with a long history of producing books that challenged the accepted historical account of the Third Reich. Choosing this publisher for her memoir was, whether consciously or not, a signal about the intended audience and the ideological community to which the book was addressed. It was not reaching for the mainstream of German historical and cultural life. It was speaking to a specific community of people who were already disposed to believe its arguments, reinforcing an existing counter-narrative rather than genuinely engaging with the historical evidence. This is ultimately the most fitting epitaph for Lena Heydrich's post-war public life. She spent it speaking to people who already agreed with her, reinforcing a worldview that was becoming increasingly marginal in German society, and engaging in legal battles that, while they sometimes produced temporary victories for herself, contributed to the longer-term strengthening of legal frameworks designed to prevent such victories in the future. She was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, fighting a losing battle. The historical record was too comprehensive, the evidence too overwhelming, the documentation too precise and too extensive. She lost as the ideology she served had lost, not because the world was unjust to it, but because the world was simply unwilling to pretend that documented mass murder was something other than what it was. And her children? What do we make, finally, of the choices they made and the lives they led? Haider, who outlived his mother by 35 years, who lived to see Germany reunited and to watch his father's story told in films and books that he had no control over, who died quietly in December 2020 during a pandemic that had isolated the world. He was perhaps the most representative figure of the perpetrator's children generation, caught between worlds, unable to fully belong to either the world of his mother's denial or the world of honest historical reckoning, finding a private equilibrium that was sustainable, if not entirely honourable. Silke and Mate, who chose silence and privacy and anonymity, they were, in their way, making the only choice that the situation seemed to offer for people who wanted simply to live rather than to be defined entirely by a history they had inherited. Whether any of them found something that could be called peace in the private hours of their long lives is not something the historical record can tell us. But the historical record can tell us this. The name they bore, the name Heydrich, is one of the most thoroughly documented names in the history of atrocity. The man who made it so is known to us in extraordinary detail, his crimes catalogued and preserved with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that he brought to the organisation of those crimes. And the family he left behind, in all their complexity and inadequacy and human limitation, lived their lives in that name's shadow, carrying it through the decades until, one by one, they could carry it no further. There is one final thread worth pulling on before we conclude, and that is the question of historical memory and how it functions differently for different communities connected to this story. For the Jewish communities whose members were murdered by the apparatus that Heydrich built and commanded, the memory of the Holocaust is not a historical abstraction, but a living wound transmitted through generations, present in family trees that end abruptly in 1942 or 1943, in the absence of grandparents and great-grandparents who should have existed but do not. For the Czech community, the memory of the occupation and of Lidis and of Operation Anthropoid is a central part of national identity, a story of suffering and resistance and survival that is taught to every Czech schoolchild and commemorated every year at the memorial sites of Prague and Lidis. For the German community, the memory is more complicated, more contested, more weighed down by the question of collective responsibility and the extent to which ordinary Germans knew about and acquiesced in what the regime was doing. For the Heydrich family, the memory is something entirely different again. It is the memory of a father and husband and brother filtered through the impossible lens of who that father and husband and brother turned out to have been in the eyes of the world. It is a private grief that can never be quite private, because the person being grieved is also a public figure of the most notorious kind. It is a family history that can never be simply a family history, because it is also, inextricably, a world history of the darkest kind. The historical significance of Operation Anthropoid also extends to its impact on the conduct of the wider war. Heydrich's death removed from the Nazi hierarchy one of its most effective and most ruthless figures. There is credible historical argument that had he survived the war, he would have been one of the most dangerous potential successors to Hitler, a man with the intelligence, the ruthlessness, and the institutional power base to have posed a genuine threat to the continued survival of the regime, or alternatively to have extended its reach and its crimes even further. His death in June 1942 created a vacuum at the top of the RSHA that was eventually filled less ably by Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the Austrian SS general who served as Heydrich's successor until the end of the war and who was subsequently tried and executed at Nuremberg. The assassination thus had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the individual, though the cost in Czech civilian lives at Lidis and Ležáky and in the broader reprisals remains the most immediate and devastating dimension of its aftermath. The relationship between heroism and atrocity in the story of Operation Anthropoid is one that historians and moralists have wrestled with extensively. Gabčík and Kubiš were undoubtedly courageous men who willingly accepted enormous personal risk in service of a just cause. The Czech civilians who sheltered them and the other paratroopers were equally courageous. At the same time, the decision to proceed with the assassination, taken in London by Czech officials who knew that massive reprisals would follow, involved a moral calculation of extraordinary difficulty. The lives of the assassins and of the Czech civilians who would inevitably suffer in the aftermath were weighed against the strategic and moral benefits of removing one of the Holocaust's most important architects. The Czech government in exile made the decision, and made it knowing that Czechs would die as a result. History has generally, though not universally, judged that decision to have been just, given the enormity of what Heydrich was doing, but the people of Lidis did not make that decision, and they paid for it with their lives. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the post-war fate of Reinhard Heydrich's family both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our other videos on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II. What happened to the wives of Nazi leaders, and what happened to Germany's top field marshals after the war? There is always more to discover about this extraordinary period of history and the long shadows it cast over the generations that followed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our future World War II content. We'll see you in the next one.